In 1943, an American family of 4 was living on the same weekly grocery money you'd spend on a single dinner out today. No food stamps in the modern sense, no credit card, no delivery app. And yet, historians who've studied their kitchen records found something almost impossible to believe. Many of these families were eating better and saving more than families twice as wealthy just a decade earlier. There was no trick to it. There was a system, one so simple it's almost embarrassing we forgot it. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how it worked. There's a line you've probably heard, maybe from a grandparent, maybe stitched on a kitchen towel. Use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without. It sounds like it was invented for World War II posters. It wasn't. It's an old New England saying, and newspapers from the early 1940s already called it an old-time byword. One some writers even traced back to something Calvin Coolidge liked to repeat. What the war did was take a quiet, private habit of thrift and turn it into a national identity. By 1942, that half-forgotten proverb was showing up in ads, on the radio, in kitchen bulletins mailed to millions of homes. A saying about not being wasteful became, almost overnight, the sound of an entire country holding itself together. But the real story isn't the slogan. It's what women actually did with a shovel, a coupon book, and a sewing needle to make it true. Picture a vacant lot behind a city apartment building, turned overnight into rows of carrots and cabbage. A widow in her 60s, kneeling in a backyard plot she'd never gardened before the war, learning to can tomatoes, because there was simply no other way to make August last through January. This wasn't a hobby. It was a quiet emergency response, repeated in tens of millions of yards. By 1944, something like 20 million Victory Gardens were producing an estimated 8 million tons of food, roughly 40% of all the fresh vegetables eaten in the entire United States that year. Read that again. Almost half the country's vegetables, grown not on farms but on porches, rooftops, and backyards, by people who mostly had never grown a thing in their lives. Even Eleanor Roosevelt put one in on the White House lawn, over the quiet objections of the groundskeeper, who worried it would ruin the grass. And it didn't stop at the harvest. A poll from January 1944 found that roughly 3 out of 4 American housewives were canning that year, and the ones who did preserved an average of over 160 jars. Imagine a pantry shelf lined that deep jar after jar, each one representing an afternoon of boiling water and burned fingers, and a mother who refused to let a single tomato go to waste. Here's the part that quietly breaks your heart if you sit with it. Historians who've studied it will tell you something that sounds backward. Despite the shortages, despite the rationing, many Americans actually ate more balanced diets during the war than they had during the Depression years right before it. Scarcity, strangely, made people healthier. Necessity taught a whole generation to value a vegetable the way we now value a luxury. Now picture the other side of that same kitchen table, the ration book itself. Starting in May 1942, every single person in a household, babies included, was issued one. Sugar came first. A family allowed about half a pound per person per week. Coffee followed later that year. By 1943, a second book arrived with red stamps for meat and dairy, blue stamps for canned goods, 64 points a month for one, 48 for the other, and the government could raise or lower the point cost of anything overnight depending on supply. That meant a pound of bacon wasn't just 30 cents. It was 30 cents and 7 precious points. Points a homemaker had already budgeted, in her head, against everything else she needed that month. Grocery shopping stopped being an errand. It became a strategy session, played out at a kitchen table with a pencil and a torn coupon book, every single week, for years. And if you think managing food was hard, wait until you hear what happened to their clothes. In March of 1942, the War Production Board issued an order that sounds almost unbelievable now. Order L85, aimed at cutting the fabric used in civilian clothing by 15%. Overnight, Hems and belts couldn't be wider than 2 inches. Pleats, ruffles, and patch pockets were banned outright. Men's suits lost their cuffs, their extra pair of trousers, their double-breasted jackets. The so-called victory suit used noticeably less cloth than the suit a man might have worn just a year before. Even something as small as a stocking became a small act of grief. When nylon stockings first hit stores in 1940, women lined up and bought 4 million pairs in 2 days flat. Within 2 years, that same nylon was needed for parachutes and rope, and stockings simply vanished. So women improvised. Some drew a faux seam up the back of a bare leg with an eyebrow pencil, just to look, for one evening, like nothing had changed at all. Nothing was thrown away. Coats were unpicked and remade into children's clothes. Worn shoe soles were patched with scraps of leather or rubber. Sewing wasn't a craft anymore. It was survival with a needle and thread, done by lamplight after the children were finally asleep. And here's the twist almost nobody expects. Clothing was never actually rationed by coupon in America the way food was. There was no clothing ration book. The government simply asked, and trusted patriotism to do the rest, and it worked well enough that men kept last year's cuffed trousers hanging quietly in the closet, rather than be seen wearing something the neighbors might call unpatriotic. If you had lived through that decade, which do you think would have broken your spirit faster, giving up sugar or giving up your favorite dress? Tell me in the comments. I want to know. Behind all of it stood a quiet paper army. The pamphlets. Government cooking bulletins and magazine inserts taught women how to stretch a single roast across 3 meals, how to bake without white sugar, how to save every spoonful of bacon grease in a tin, can by the stove because rendered fat could be turned back in at the butcher shop for a few extra ration points. Fat that the military needed for explosives. A can of kitchen grease, sitting under the sink, was quietly part of the war effort. Women's magazines ran recipes for mock everything. Mock apple pie made without apples, meatless meals dressed up to feel like a real dinner. These weren't sad substitutes. Home economists treated the ration book like a puzzle to be solved with pride, and a woman who could turn a thin week into a full table was admired the way we might admire a chef today. But underneath all these clever tricks was something deeper than thrift. It was a whole philosophy about what a home was for. Here's what strikes me the longer I sit with this. These women weren't poor by choice, and they weren't performing simplicity for an audience. There was no one watching. No camera, no algorithm to reward the prettiest jar of preserves. They mended a sock because a sock, mended, was still a sock, and buying a new one meant less wool for a soldier's coat. Every small, invisible choice in that kitchen was tied, quietly, to someone standing in a field on the other side of the world. That's the part our modern version of frugality often misses. It wasn't about looking humble. It was about understanding, in your bones, that your dollar and your labor were connected to something larger than your own household. A woman canning tomatoes at midnight wasn't just feeding her family. She believed, and she was largely right, that she was helping to win a war. And maybe the strangest twist of all is this. When the war ended and rationing finally lifted, plenty of these same women kept gardening, kept canning, kept mending long after nobody asked them to anymore. The habit had stopped being an emergency measure. It had simply become who they were. There's a particular kind of pride in that, not the loud kind, not the kind that gets applause. The pride of a full pantry shelf built from nothing but patience. The pride of a coat, remade twice, still keeping a child warm in its 3rd winter. Nobody wrote medals for that. But if you ask historians what actually won a war fought on 2 oceans, they'll tell you it wasn't only the factories and the soldiers. It was also 20 million backyard gardens and millions of women who refused, quietly and without complaint, to waste a single thing that could still be useful. Somewhere, a granddaughter still has that half-torn ration book in a drawer. She probably doesn't know exactly what her grandmother went without to make those stamps last the month. But every time we talk about it, We keep that quiet triumph from disappearing entirely. So the next time someone tells you frugality is a modern trend, remember the woman with the torn coupon book and the tomato jars lined up like soldiers on a shelf. She didn't have a trick. She had a promise to keep, and she kept it, week after week, for years. If someone in your family lived through this, a grandmother, a great-aunt, anyone who remembers a ration book or a victory garden, tell me about them in the comments below. I'd genuinely love to read it.